Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Anna Raunik, the Executive Director of Content and Client Services here at the State Library, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the State Librarian and my colleagues to welcome you to the State Library for our final Game Changers event for 2019. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to those of you watching via the live stream. Let me begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their continuing connection to land and as custodians of stories for millennia. We are inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. Our speaker for tonight, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Rolf Gomes, cardiologist and founder of Heart of Australia. Our facilitator, Ray Weeks, chairman of the CEO Institute. Helen Brodie, President of the Queensland Library Foundation. Robina Xavier, Executive Dean of the QUT Queensland Business School. Members of the Library Board of Queensland, Queensland Library Foundation, QUT Business School, and the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame Governing Committee. Our generous donors and partners, Pitcher Partners, Channel 7, Morgans, NAB, and RACQ. And of course, friends and supporters of the State Library. Thank you for joining us tonight for the final Game Changers conversation for 2019. Game Changers is an initiative of the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame and brings together innovative leaders from business, technology, creative industries who encourage us to think bigger and better. Established in 2009, by the State Library, Queensland Library Foundation and QUT Business School, the Hall of Fame celebrates and records and retells stories of our outstanding business leaders and their contribution to the development of Queensland. Our game-changing leaders have shared their highs, lows and lessons from their time in business. This year we've heard from Cameron Costello, CEO of Kondamuka Aboriginal Corporation, Kirsten Ferguson, Company Director and award-winning expert in leadership, and Leanne Kemp, Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur and CEO and founder of Everledger. If you've missed any of these inspiring conversations, forget Netflix this weekend and watch one of the free recordings available on our website. Tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from cardiologist Dr. Rolf Gomes. His team brings specialist cardiology services to people living in rural and remote Queensland, providing the sorts of services we take for granted here in the city. Heart of Australia's customised medical road trains have already travelled more than 150,000 kilometres, reaching towns such as Barcaldine, Quilpie and Emerald. The work of this trailblazing medical professions is well documented in State Library's collections. For example, we hold Eleanor Bourne's papers, the state's first female doctor. We are also custodians of mementos from the Middle East, from one of the nation's most decorated World War I nurse, Sister Constance Keys. Or if it's reference books you're after, you could explore a selection of ebooks on our website and catalogue, such as the ABC of Cardiology for the non-specialist. There's so much more to learn and discover at the library. One of the ways we showcase our collections and expertise is through exhibitions such as the recently opened Meet Me at the Paragon. The exhibition on level 4 explores the lives of hardworking Greek migrants who established cafes and milk bars in the early 20th century. Step back in time to when steaks were $2.50 and milkshakes were served in anodized cups. Please make some time to visit this special exhibition. We also support today's business community through the Business Studio, our website, exhibitions and digital stories. If you're feeling motivated to learn a new skill, library members can access more than 5,000 courses and 130,000 video tutorials. Now, if you're live streaming tonight, perhaps from one of the remote communities serviced by Heart of Australia, you can tweet your questions as we go by using the hashtag QBLHOF. Don't forget to add your location so we know where you're coming from. Audience members are free to tweet questions or hold on to them to the end of the Q&A session. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rolf Gomes and tonight's facilitator, Roy Weeks. Thank you.
I'm not Rolf. I promise you that, right? So, good evening. This remarkable story of Dr. Rolf Gomes in the heart of Australia is worth telling just for so many reasons, but of course mainly for the lives that are being saved in rural and regional communities by these state-of-the-art clinics on wheels known as the heart trucks. Rolf Gomes came to Australia with his family from Calcutta, or Kolkata, when he was just 10 years old, and all the family had was $200. Rolf became an electrical engineer, and then in a totally natural progression, a cardiologist. That's what we're going to work out tonight. As a cardiologist, he quickly understood that whilst people living in major cities take access to cardiac specialist treatment for granted, people in rural and remote communities have been going without. As a result, they are likely, twice as likely, to die as their city cousins. Now, Rolf founded Heart of Australia's revolutionary mobile clinic to provide these specialist cardiology healthcare services. Tonight we'll go on this very special journey with Rolf, a journey of incredible frustrations for him with funding, technology, and obstacles from established health authorities, to name just a few. It's a wonderful story, which you fully understand tonight, of courage, energy, passion, and commitment. A story of a disruptor who simply would not take no for an answer. It's the story of one who, with the support of his wife, took out a hefty mortgage on their home to launch the first heart truck. He then doubled the size of his operation. He launched a second truck. And thousands of patients have used the service, and hundreds of lives have been saved. And Rolf tells me that some of the patients show up crying when they see the heart truck come into town. People realise they haven't been forgotten. A genuine game changer. Please welcome Dr. Rolf Gomes. Rolf, just let me ask first, anyone would have balked at some of the challenges that you faced in getting Heart of Australia running. Now, why was it so important to you, and what made you so committed to its success?
Well, Ray, I mean, everyone, I suppose, has a personal driver, and you know, the words of your parents, they do come back to haunt you in later life. And I remember when I was about 13, my dad distinctively said to me, he said, I stepped off a plane with 4 suitcases, 4 children, and $200 to come to a country because I thought it had so much opportunity. And you know, and all those reasons had come to fruition. I'd had the opportunity to get an education. Actually, I ended up with engineering, then medicine, and here I found myself, you know, with the world ahead of me. And there's a wanting to give back. There was certainly that. But then in your junior years as a doctor at the coalface, when they send you out as a junior doctor, you see firsthand some of the impracticalities and the difficulties. And I suppose somewhere along the line, the engineering and the medicine have come back together, and this idea of how we're going to get specialists, but not just people like myself with their stethoscope out in the bush, but if I'm going to go there, I want my toolbox with me. The treadmills, the ultrasound machines, the lung function testing machines, and well, you can't fit them in a plane. What about a truck? And it sounds like a simple idea, but obviously there's a lot of steps along the way.
Exactly. Yeah. And in changing professions, I mean, what have been some of the big learnings along the way for you?
Well, you know, my formal training's in engineering and medicine. I've never had any business background, but something like this, by default, you end up having to learn a little bit about business, hiring staff, looking after insurances, paying bills. But also, I think one of the revelations was coming from an engineering profession initially. I had worked 2 years in a petrochemical company. And engineering, like any technology discipline, it's really a slave to innovation. In fact, resistance is futile. And then you go into a profession like medicine, which is steeped in tradition. And to a large extent in that environment, innovation is enslaved by the hierarchy. So I could see an obvious contrast in the two disciplines, and like a rat in a cage trying to say, why aren't we looking for better ways to do things? Why do we keep accepting the status quo? Why have there been white papers and blue papers and 10-point plans and 4 pillars and 5 pillars and 1,000,001 ways to talk about how to bring services in the bush, and, well, what about this idea? And
But you came right up against the health authorities. You came up against a view about a private provider versus the public provision of services. How did you handle that conflict?
Well, I often thought that, when you talk about public and private and the notion of the healthcare consumer, which a term I don't like personally, the word consumer implies you have a choice. And for people in the city, there is a choice. If you went to see a GP and needed to see a cardiologist, you could see someone privately like myself, or you could go to the Royal Brisbane Hospital, and it's a government-funded service. Whereas if you're out in Charleville and you happen to live 80 kilometres from there in Augathella with pain in your chest and you want someone to tell you, am I on the verge of dropping dead of a heart attack, or can I just get away with some Mylanta? And the only service in town happens to be a truck which comes along which could help answer that question. Then the whole concept of public and private is irrelevant.
Falls away, doesn't it?
Because government, I've always thought, has an obligation to provide equitable access to healthcare. So that was my argument. That was my position, I should say, as to, in reality, governments can't do everything. And sometimes the private sector has a bit more flexibility to try new things.
But funding didn't come easy, did it? From the state, federal governments, it trickled through.
Yeah, no, that was difficult. And naively, in hindsight, I thought that, certainly not in the beginning, I could understand that specialists and equipment and trucks in the bush, that the level of risk was going to be too high for governments to jump on board. But I thought after 3 years, with a track record of delivering services safely, GPs absolutely loved it, the people loved it, and it was saving a lot of time and money, not just for patients, but probably for the government as well, that there'd be an appetite for a partnership. When that didn't come, it was very disappointing, to be honest. But
we'll come back to the further funding that came through, but this was a social impact enterprise.
Yeah.
But as referred to earlier, it's got to have a solid business case, doesn't it? Otherwise it can't survive.
That's true, and look, the business case is important, but I think in this instant, the social case, when I looked at it, was so strong. What's the purpose of medicine? To prolong life and ease suffering. Here are people out in the bush, every one of them has got a heart, no one's getting younger. And what can we do to offer them the same chance of a long life and less suffering than those in the city? So the social case was very strong. The challenge was, how do we build a business case around it? Now, working in private practice, I understood the basic economics of running a medical practice, but then there's all these bolt-on additional costs, drivers, accommodation, flights, and how do we find some additional revenue streams to try and make the lines cross? So I think there's a bit of, probably a little bit of entrepreneurship in how we achieved that in the end.
Exactly. You demonstrated that. You were born in Kolkata, India, and as we spoke, you moved to Australia when you were 9, 10 years old. Well, how did the experiences in your early childhood shape who you are today?
Yeah, well, one of the things about being born in a third world country, and I was very fortunate to have arrived in Australia at an age where my memories of that country are still fairly formed. When people talk about the starving kids, I know what they are because I caught a rickshaw to school and saw them at the side of the road. But it does frame your perspective. I understand how little you need to actually be happy. You know, as a child, and we weren't well off, with my cousins, we'd find a cricket bat and a tennis ball, go down in the laneway, and a bunch of street kids would turn up out of the woodwork, and we'd have a game of cricket till sunset with a bat and a tennis ball. And, you know, it was complete joy. So I often say I was fortunate in a sense, because when I set off on this journey, I wasn't encumbered by wealth or reputation.
And you were selected as being in Queensland's 50 best and brightest for 214 of the Courier Mail newspaper, and the Heart of Australia was launched in October 2014. Culmination of a 5-year journey, really, wasn't it? To transform this vision into a reality.
Oh,
There were some major obstacles on the way. You might just take us through a few more of what
Well,
you had to deal with.
You know, it sounds like a great idea, put specialists in equipment and trucks, but there are obviously a lot of steps in between, and one of them was finding some like-minded organisations to provide some funding. And certainly we went down a lot of dry gullies. I remember in the early days I was in a 12-month conversation with a mining company, which, as the mining boom fell off the radar, you know, that conversation fizzled and 12 months wasted. A lot of trips, giving a lot of talks to, to directors and watching the eyes glaze over, and suddenly realising saving lives in the bush was probably not as important for them. But look, we got there in the end, and two things I always remembered. One of the jobs I had in my early years was selling things door to door. I applied for an ad in the paper over the summer holidays as a university student, make $400 a day. And I turned up and they said, here are crates of Elmo bumper cars and solar-powered radios and, believe it or not, electric cigarette lighters, and go out and sell them. And every morning they would give you a pep talk.
Yep.
And one of the things which would be drummed into you is the law of averages, that every rejection brings you closer to success. It was the law of averages. You know, so every time you got a door shut in your face, you're actually getting closer to success.
I sold encyclopedias. That did not work. No way in hell.
But so that was one thing which I always took away from that.
Yep.
And I actually did quite well in it. And the other thing was, you know, in engineering, there's a mathematical process called the NewtonRaphson Method, which is a process where you find a solution through cycles of iteration. And every iteration you get an answer, which you plug it in the equation, and it brings you closer to the actual result. And I remember, I thought, well, you know, all right, well, we're not going to do the same thing again at the next presentation. I'll just refine it a little bit and change the story and try and look at it from their perspective. And, you know, lo and behold, one night I was asked to give a talk for 5 minutes at the end of the major presentation, and I cancelled the clinic in Brisbane and I drove to Toowoomba in the afternoon. I was thinking, well, this is getting a bit desperate now. 5 minutes to talk about my dream. And I stepped off the stage, and it was the most remarkable night, because as I stepped off the stage, Stuart Morland, who runs a company called IOR Petroleum, jumped over a few chairs, handed me his business card and said, well, there's your diesel sorted out. And at the same evening, I met some representatives from Arrow Energy who've gone on to become our foundation partner. So,
a major contributor.
Major contributor. And really transformed this vision into, this is now going to happen.
So a game changer is one who approaches business in a way that disrupts the status quo, challenges the norms, creates a new way of doing things. Do you see yourself as a game changer?
Well, I think so, because, well, actually, yes, I do. Because what we're doing is something which had been thought very difficult, almost impossible. How do we firstly find specialists, and how do we get them out in the bush in a sustainable fashion? And, you know, over the last 5 years, we've grown from 3 to 23 specialists and seen over 7,000 patients, and the service is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And whatever happens from this point on, no one can look back and say, we're not sure if there's a model which works, because this one has now got a very solid track record of being able to achieve that.
And tell me, to what extent can you be described, just following off the game changer, to what extent can you be described as a disruptor? We understand how the health authorities responded to you, but you must have been seen by a number of individuals and organisations as a disruptor. Do you see yourself in that way, disrupting?
Only to the sense that if doing something worthwhile requires you to break out of the mould, then yes, I'm a disruptor. I mean, I've always been a critical thinker and understood that, for example, words which are used interchangeably to mean the same things, but they actually aren't. Things like, we would like to work in a more collaborative way, which is pseudo speak for you need to get permission. Now, I'm happy to collaborate. Do I need permission? Probably not.
That's right. And there are these digital changes too. There's been a number of digital changes that really enabled the success of Heart of Australia, haven't they?
Yeah. And I think this is something which I've always, one of the reasons why I like going out in the bush and getting out there where the sky meets the horizon. It's because you get to think clearly and join the dots. So a couple of things were happening around this time. There's a miniaturisation of technology. When I was a cardiology registrar, an ultrasound machine was the size of a washing machine. And in fact, I was pushing one of these through a lift one day, and a patient thought I was polishing the floor. And he said, you're doing a good job there. I thought, well, as long as you think I'm doing a good job, I'll take it. So there's a miniaturisation of technology. There's huge leaps and bounds in internet capacity. We transmit 20 gigabytes of data a day. 10 years, that would have been difficult. There's the introduction of electronic health records. So whilst all of these things are evolving in parallel, they give rise to new opportunities. And I recognised a few of these things, and also government's investment in road, in the quality of the roads.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, we're looking to get up to Weipa, and watching very closely the Peninsula Development Road at the moment to see when that's completed. So, they make these things more viable.
Let's talk about the people who work with you. What do you look for in the people who work with you in terms of values, behaviours and so on? What do they have to demonstrate to make you interested in being with them?
Yeah. I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I like loyalty. And because everyone, when things are going well, everyone's relaxed. When things aren't going well, you need your team to stick with you. I look for people who take pride in what they do, but they have to be able to do it. So not everyone I expect to be out-of-the-box thinkers, because sometimes you need people to just keep the items in the box tidy. And they're very valuable.
Just think in the box. Huh?
And when they do their job well and take pride in it, they don't want to be setting the agenda, whereas, some people do, and that's great too. But people who take pride in the work they do, who are loyal, and ultimately have a good work ethic.
Let's talk about your own personal attributes. What personal attributes do you think have been fundamental to your success? And let's talk about your values as well.
I think if you ask people, they'll say you must have a lot of courage. And for me, it's, the external perception of the risks I take are a little bit different to the way I perceive them. They're more calculated risks. I believe, certainly for me, being really clear in what I'm trying to do, having that clarity of thought is crucial. and ultimately having the persistence and the resilience and not being too concerned about your own ego and really value the work and what the work means and what the work achieves and the people it benefits. That's the driver for me. As an example, one of the things which comes up is, Rolf, the patients you see out in the bush, does that impact your colleagues in Brisbane? And to be honest, I've never understood the question because, I'm thinking about the health and welfare of tens of thousands of people who are out there, who need these sort of services. I'm not particularly concerned about the 25 cardiologists in Brisbane. I'm sure they've got plenty of milk in the fridge. That's my own view.
Yeah, of course.
I think what I'm doing is in line with the spirit of what medicine's about.
So what do you know about yourself now? You didn't know about yourself in those early days. What have you learned about yourself?
Certainly about the extent of resilience and the output, the capacity of how your output can be very undefined. People who say, after an 8-hour day, that's about it. A 40-hour week is like a part-time job for me. I don't think about it that way. When you enjoy your work to the point that work becomes more fun than fun, you're actually in a very fortunate position.
So who in your life has influenced your values? Most important influence on you?
I think my parents would, I remember, my mother was she is an incredible lady in the sense that what she didn't have an opportunity, she certainly had an aspiration. Born in a village in India, poor family, got a few scholarships to get her through school, but had the foresight to immigrate with her family to Australia. But for example, I came home from school one day and there's a yellow sticker on the back door and it said, "If it is to be, it is up to me." And she thought, well, I'll imprint this on my kids' brains for that. She obviously did. And she'd cut out articles from newspapers and she'd give them to us to read. She'd say, "Read about this. This is interesting. This is a new breakthrough." And when we didn't read it, it would end up in the toilet because she knew that by putting it there, we would read it. And, for example, there's a poem called "The Man in the Glass." I'm not sure if people have ever heard of this poem. It's called "The Man in the Glass," but it ended up stuck in the toilet wall.
You want to recite part of this for us? Or?
Yeah, I probably can. When you get what you want and you struggle for self and the world makes you king for a day, then go to the mirror and look at yourself and see what that man has to say.
Very good.
And it goes on and on, but it's worth having a look at.
Look at is there a personal story where you came to understand your strengths and your leadership capacity? Just one story that stands out for you? When I was in university, I used to like going camping. People ask me, "Were you born in the bush?" And I said, quite the opposite, Calcutta. Think of an ant's nest. It's quite the opposite to the bush. But I did enjoy going camping, and I took about 5 guys, and we went camping to a spot I knew because my high school used to take us there. It was a beautiful spot by the Tambo River up in the Blue Mountains. But when we got there, this a huge eucalyptus tree had fallen across the river. And as a result, it had dammed this little patch where we used to camp, and the water had come across into the sand bed where we would normally pitch our tents. And I was so irate at the whole situation, having driven after 4.5 hours. And I said, "Oh, look, we're going to have to get in this river and move this tree." And the others, I think they just opened up some stubbies and sat there. I thought, where will we go next? And I was just so angry about, turning up to find this tree fallen in the river. So
stripped down, and I got in the river, and I was diving and picking up rocks and trying to dislodge this tree. And after about 15 minutes, one other bloke stepped in. He goes, "Oh, I'll give you a hand, Rolf. You useless bugger." And within about half an hour, we had 5 guys heaving and pushing this tree, and we ended up turning it facing the river and floated this tree down the river. And as the tree floated away, I just saw the sandbank reappear. And, and we pitched our tent and had a great time. But it always stuck in my mind that, for me, that was, just rolling up your sleeves and leadership by example and inspiring other people to believe in what you're trying to do.
So if I asked your team members to describe you, what do you think they'd say?
I think they'll say, "When does he sleep?" Look, I'm not sure. I'd like to think they'd say he's a lot of fun. I've never been particularly worried about what people think of me. Yeah, and people used to, in the early days, say, "Oh, Rolf, just be careful about your reputation." And I'd say, "What reputation are we talking about? I don't have a reputation. What's the reputation? I'm a terrible dancer, or I'm awkward with women. What's the so-called reputation I'm supposed to have? I just want to do something worthwhile, and I'm not going to waste time."
So what's been your greatest achievement?
Look, my greatest achievement would have to be, I'm married very well, because you can't do any of these things without a supportive spouse. My children. The other day we were at the dinner table and we were arguing, of all things, over NAPLAN results. And I turned around to my son and I said, "Oh, Lenny, the most important thing in life is to work hard and get good grades." And he turned around to me and he said, "Oh, I thought it was to be kind." And it just shut me up. And coming from a 9-year-old,
That's right.
He has that's. I feel proud that he has that spirit in him, and he's got that spirit of generosity in him. So I mean, I would like to think when I'm dead and gone, and when I've exited the planet, that the Heart of Australia program will be out there looking after future generations and doing the work it's doing.
Let's talk about the next 3 years too, but just come back to one other thing. You've been looking at what are the cutting-edge treatments you can deliver to these rural, regional communities.
Yeah.
What are they? What other cutting-edge treatments are you looking at, other than cardiac services?
Well, if you think about, I'm a cardiologist, so we started off with cardiology services. It's a good place to start. But I say to people, I'm not trying to deliver a cardiac service to the bush. I'm trying to deliver a mobile Wickham terrace.
It's a good statement.
So anything you can do without having to walk into a hospital, you could do potentially on a mobile service like Heart of Australia. Now, if you look at the 3 things which are likely to get you, heart disease, stroke and cancer, and mental health is becoming increasingly so, in young people especially. Cancer is, I think, something, especially looking after regional oncology patients, is something I'd really like to look into. And for me to do that, we need to have a mobile CT service because it helps in the diagnosis, and we know that cancers in the bush are diagnosed a lot later. It helps in the diagnosis, and it also helps in facilitating chemotherapy for patients out in the bush. So certainly diagnostic radiology services as a mobile offering would be fantastic. And all the things which have now become disposable. For example, urology services, being able to examine the lower urinary tract with a mobile cystoscope and disposable sheath. That's something we're looking to get onto the trucks at the moment. And as these things become more smaller, things become less dependent on sterilisation, they create new opportunities.
So looking back, say you're looking back in 3 years' time, what results or what outcomes would really satisfy you?
Well, I would like to see the Heart of Australia program across the country. Certainly Western Australia, Northern New South Wales, the Northern Territory. It's not a problem restricted to Queensland, and all those areas, this model would work very well. I'd also like to see a sustainable workforce. The way we've approached specialist services in the past, individuals and taking it all on in themselves, they've done a fantastic job, but it's very piecemeal. And we've got to move away from that piecemeal, individual altruistic approach. I've always said Heart of Australia, I'd like it to become the land-based version of the flying doctors, but not for emergency services, but how we deliver specialists, a brand, a focus. And when people say, how are we going to bring specialists out in the regions, well, how can Heart of Australia assist in that regard?
Just speak about leadership for a moment. And what advice would you give someone going into a leadership position for the first time?
Look, I think ultimately the currency you trade in is your integrity, without a doubt. I mean, once you start sacrificing that, you're on very shaky ground. So I mean, by all, definitely be clear on your vision, act in a way which maintains your integrity, keep to your word, look after the people who work in your organisation, because ultimately, whether you're talking about staff or committees or boards, associations, it comes down to people. And, just lead by example.
Good. Questions from the audience. We have a roving microphone too, so if you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up. Any questions there? I'm not leaving here until you ask questions. There's one right here. Thanks.
Thanks, Rolf. Jo Cleary. It's nice to see the crisis from the air and the specialists on the bus. What about the prevention and health? Where's that going nowadays, do you think, especially in the bush, where people can't afford to have the time to get sick?
Look, preventative health is definitely something which we should focus on, without a doubt. One of the things about preventative health is that those sort of messages are enhanced by having the higher level services present. I'll give you an example. When I first start going into a community, I find a lot of patients who've had a heart attack at some point who haven't seen a specialist for maybe 10 years, who are walking around with a cholesterol of 6 or 7, a blood pressure a little bit high, and it's not life-saving surgery which you're doing in those people, but you're trying to get back to those targets. In a lot of these communities, the GP workforce is very transient. So, for example, when we go to Quilpie, they have a new locum GP every 2 weeks. So our service is now becoming the mainstay service in that community. So, I mean, the opportunities for preventative health relate to some extent, education and a stable health service in a community, and having those touch points where you can reinforce the health message to those patients. Yeah.
Thanks for that. There's a question down here, please. Thank you. Just wait for the microphone if you don't mind. Thanks. Thanks, Nat, just over here. Yeah, thanks.
Listening to you speak, I think everybody here was very much inspired. Very much inspired. And I thought with television now, people are listening in. And can you tell us a story of someone you know that you have inspired, that hopefully, having heard that story, others will also be inspired to do things like you are doing?
That's a good question.
Right. Well, for me, I'm just trying to think if I can think of an individual. Let me come back to that question, and I will think of someone.
Just while there's one that's question right here. Thanks. Nat, up here.
Firstly, thank you for the service. I've been following this for a long time, and it's just fantastic. But my question is just a basic one. I'm gathering that the service is based out of here in Brisbane, and you talk about hopefully getting it around the country. Do you find, as you expand into different specialties and so on, that actually getting specialists to give the time to get out to the bush is easy, or is it a little bit difficult? Do you have people lining up to get involved, or is it still a bit of a slog?
Well, put it this way, in the early days when we first got going, 3 cardiologists were friends of mine. And they knew I wasn't going to go away. We've now got 6 cardiologists as part of the program. The others who've come along haven't been people I've known personally through my training. And in total, we now have 23 specialists. So when I look back as to the reasons why I personally balked at becoming the sole cardiologist, say, in Biloela or in Emerald, there's 2 reasons. One is there's a psychological isolation. Am I taking this all on my own? What if my family circumstances change? What if my city practice gets too busy? What if I fall ill? Will I be letting the whole community down? The second thing is that there's a logistical burden. Who's going to book my flights, my accommodation? Who's going to pick me up from the airport? Who's going to make sure I have a sonographer there to help me? Who's going to make sure the equipment all works, do the billing, ring the patients, SMS them to make sure they turn up? So there's a individual psychological hurdle, and there's also this logistical hurdle. Now, once you remove that through an organisation like Heart of Australia, where people feel like they're part of a bigger family, that yes, I'd like to contribute to rural health, but I don't want to, I want someone else to take responsibility for filling my shoes if for some reason I have to pull out. And all I want is my itinerary emailed to me on a Friday night, and I'll pack my stethoscope and hop on a plane, and someone else has to sort out the rest. So once the program actually achieves that, it creates a sense of family, a sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself, and it removes all the logistical barriers which are often enough to make people say that might just be a bit too hard for me. So that was the intention, and that's certainly what's panning out at the moment. Governments are training a lot more specialists, so there'll be a lot more specialists looking for work, and I think that will work in our favour as well.
Do you want to share with us the biggest mistake you've made, or the major regret that you might have?
Oh, look, the major... I'm a very impatient person, and sometimes you need to exercise a little bit of restraint and manage your frustration. It's a blessing and a curse. As you get older, you realise that you need to control your passion. There's a saying: if you want to go quickly, go on your own. If you want to go far, go with others. And as your organisation grows, you need others to join you on your journey. And you just don't want to burn your bridges when you're young and hot-blooded.
Just talking about hot-blooded too. You said before you've got a risk appetite.
Yeah.
But what kind of risk taker really are you?
look, I always know, can I pull myself out of this hole? If it all turns to poop, can I pull myself out of this hole? That was one of the reasons why I decided to start young. I was 35, and I'd walk into my practice and there'd be patients in the waiting room, and I thought, well, this will probably go on for the rest of my life. People say you've got a lot of time, but you haven't got a minute to lose. And I thought, well, I want to have a crack at this, and I'm not going to wait till I'm 50. I've got to do it now. If it doesn't work, well, I've given it both barrels, and I won't die wondering. And I suppose the rest is history.
Another final question from anyone? Right up here. Thanks. Thank you.
You said at the beginning of your talk that Heart of Australia sounds like a simple idea. What was it, or what sort of factors prevented something like that from being started previously? And what was it uniquely within your capacity to help or to overcome those factors?
I think it's a simple idea. I don't think it's particularly revolutionary in the idea itself. You've got to be nuts. You've got to have an appetite for risk. You have to have a certain amount of self-belief and the ability to back yourself. And it was going to be a lot of hard work. I knew that, but that doesn't worry me. I'm sort of used to hard work. But I think for example, when I first talked about doing this, people would say, Rolf, this is going to be a financial nightmare for you. All the patients you see out there will be bulk billed. There's no way you'll be able to generate enough income to cover your costs. And I understood that. But at the same time, I understood that this was something which other people would be interested in. And there would be, I recognised the other revenue streams from government in the fullness of time, corporate sponsors, even whilst we're not a charity, the philanthropic aspect of it. So I thought, well, yes, look, I understand that as a cookie cutter medical practice business case, it makes no sense at all. But I also understand that there are ways we can work on the shortfall. So I think that when I tried to explain that to a lot of people, I sensed that they didn't believe it to the same extent I did. One of the things which was often said is people aren't going to give you any money as a private individual trying to do this. And I said, well, I think the story is easy to tell, and as long as we deliver on our end of the bargain, they will. And I was right.
There was a final question up here. Thanks for that.
Thank you. I'm just starting with a very short story, that it's about Marie Curie. And in the World War II, she used to go helping the doctors with the kind of very small truck called the Little Curie, where she did radiographies of the patients in order to help to do the operations on site. So this is a suggestion. You might would like to name your next truck in an homage to that. My question is, so I'm very interested in sex and gender analysis within biomedical research, and focusing on a previous question regarding prevention. So would you be considering, or do you already do, how can I explain? would you be interested in connecting with women patients and explaining the type of differences that exist? Specifically in terms of symptoms for a stroke. And also, I was just checking your website, and I don't see a lot of women on your team. So, is there a reason, or would you like to recruit more?
Thank you for the question. You know, in fact, our entire Brisbane office, there's only one other male staff member. So, I mean, I like the company of women in a professional sense. Look, I mean, I've never actually thought about it, to be honest, how many women and men are involved with Heart of Australia, but I'll go have a look now. And certainly it's not an insular organisation. Anyone who'd like to contribute is more than welcome. And maybe we can touch base later and see what you have in mind.
So Rolf, can you offer any parting advice? We've got emerging business people, we've got entrepreneurs, innovators in the audience tonight. Can you offer any parting advice for them?
Look, I think, you know, when you come up with something genuinely different and it's going to sort of challenge the status quo, there'll always be criticism. And you really need to be able to think carefully and listen to the criticism, but work out what is based on fact and what is based on conjecture. Because otherwise it can destroy your dream very quickly. Once you've worked out it's worth pursuing, it's great to have a good idea, but the success ultimately comes down to the execution. That's right. And there's a lot of steps between a good idea and a successful business. And all the art is in the execution. You know, there's a saying that, you know, the secret is to plant a seed of opportunity every day. And I read that once and I started to actually live it. You know, whether it was a phone call or an email or a note in a pad. Because whilst we all have good ideas, unless you commit those ideas to some form of action, they never actually realise, they just disappear into the ether. Right. So the simple act of writing down an idea, sending an email, you know, as trivial as it sounds, it commits your thoughts into an action. And that's what has to happen for anything to evolve from it.
Please thank Dr. Rolf Gomes. Rolf, thank you. Fantastic.
Thank you, Rolf, for sharing those insights with us tonight. I'm Robina Xavier. I'm the Executive Dean of the QUT Business School. We probably could have helped you with a bit of that business knowledge in those early days, but we are rewriting some curricula at the moment, and I did think a unit in enslaved innovation would probably go down pretty well, actually. You've clearly demonstrated to us tonight that approach of not accepting the status quo, and that's really been throughout your story, which is fantastic. I've been to a number of these events now, and I do think you've probably had the most curious description of resilience that we will remember. Certainly selling electric lighters is going to go down there. And also an amazing, memorable story of leadership, of rolling up your sleeves and leading by the front. There's no doubt that those 7,000 patients thank you, and so do we. So please join me in thanking Dr. Rolf Gomes. For those of you who would like to revisit the conversation tonight or share it with your friends or colleagues, the webcast and transcript will be available on the State Library and Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame website within the week. A special thanks to Ray Weeks for your wonderful interview tonight, but also throughout the series, and your contribution to all that the Hall of Fame does. Thank you very much. As Anna outlined at the start, we've had an amazing series for 2019, and we've got an equally exciting program planned for 2020. So stay tuned via the Hall of Fame website, and we'll announce the speakers for 2020 in the coming months, and we're obviously looking forward to seeing you join us again next year. On behalf of the Governing Committee and the founding partners, I'd like to thank our sponsors, who of course make all of this possible. For 2019, our principal sponsors, Picture Partners, our television sponsor Channel 7, and the major sponsors Morgans, NAB and RACQ. We are so grateful for your ongoing support, and I'd like you to join me in thanking them all. For those of you joining us online, that's the end of our night, but for those in the audience with us, we'd like you to join us out on the Queensland Terrace for refreshments, supported by our generous sponsors, Clovelly Estate and Newstead Brewing Company. Thank you again for your support. Travel safe, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.